Welcome to Dawn Patrol. Let's have breakfast. Fruit Loops, crunchy and colorful. Whoa, milky explosion, so crazy. Oops, big spill, what a mess. Dawn Patrol signing off. See you tomorrow.
Morning. I thought that would be a pretty funny intro. Anyway, hold on a minute. I had this set up. What's up, Matt? Good morning. So I thought today would be cool to go over some of the things that happened in that video with Father Stephen DeYoung and Tucker Carlson. I thought that it would be cool to kind of go over some of the stuff that I found, I guess, interesting and also enlightening for me, just in general, in the way that I see people, the way that they seem to be coming out, and what they're trying to convey. Um, so, with that, I just want to start off and say, um, last night I was in class and we were talking about the different denominations and with church history. It's pretty amazing because one of the coolest things about church history is that you can see how God is using these different traditions for people at different points in their life and in their walk, in the way that they're made up. I can see a value in each tradition, um, in how it relates to the individual, how God uses it to relate to them, and then also what attracts them to that. So, in the most charitable sense, I want to kind of focus on that. The things that in regards, and one of the things about Father Stephen that I found interesting after I had to watch it a second time because I think I was so hung up on what the first three quarters of the interview was all about the KFAB stuff, and and it was all about um, you know, Matt got in there first, just for the record. Um, that it was clearly about sensationalism, sensationalizing, and that's obviously what Tucker was there for. But it's kind of like, okay, he had to realize why he was being asked to come on Tucker. So he definitely had to feed the request, right? So there was that. But then he also had this opportunity, and you could see towards the end he leveraged the opportunity. And But anyway, one of the things that worried me most is that he leaned heavily into the things that I found fascinating when I first was coming back into the Bible and reading the Bible, and I wanted to just get as much information as possible. Um, and I don't know whether it's me, I don't know if it's because I'm a guy, or what the real reason is, but I was attracted to the unusual stories of the Bible, the stories that everybody leans away from and doesn't really talk about. So you got like one or two verses in the Bible that talk about these men of renown, and taking brides, human brides. I could read the verse, but the way, I mean, then the translations differ, but it's like you could see that, especially listening to Jacob on his channel, and him explaining like where these words came from, where the Nephilim word came from, and where it originated, and so he kind of went over that a little bit, which I thought was pretty important because a lot of times these words just get conflated. Now, there's clearly a line from Cain that doesn't really get talked about much And it seems that when they talk about this, especially before the flood, that these dudes, this race, leaned into the evil, and so they were extremely wicked. They definitely didn't. Definitely weren't seeking the creator of the universe. They were. It was all. They were all about themselves, and so they kind of, uh, to use the corner's words, they embodied the horrible, right? And looking in the Book of Jubilee, one of the things that they were talking about is it seems like God almost basically he allowed them, he gave them the sword. And so, like later on, he talks about uh, technology, which I disagree with. He said technology is given to is a gift from the demons, which I don't. That's not how I'm reading it. How I'm reading it is that allows them to figure out how to create weapons with the sole purpose of them being who they are. They were going to ultimately be killing themselves because of them leaning into this. So, and then of course, at some point, God raises up Israel to defeat them and wipe them out, finally. But he also, before that, let me back up a little bit. One of the first things he talks about is this idea of unions with with God, these hybrid humans. So it's like he's leaning into this idea that is, why he's there, the salacious stuff. And of course, Tucker says he asks, and this is what's so crazy about it. It's like you go down a road or you have a belief and you unpack that belief with certainty. And then you get a question that you were like, whoops, that's not what I meant. Because then Tucker asks him, yeah, so these angels mated with humans, so they were hybrid. They had actually different DNA. And then Tucker goes, so Jesus was a hybrid. And you could see like he had to like reframe this, and he's good at he was good at jostling back out of it, because I mean ultimately that would be, I mean, he had to distinguish the fact that the Holy Spirit came upon Mary and how this conception took place that differed from these fallen ones, so it became a slippery slope, and it really stemmed from talking so much about something that the Bible talks very little about. So I could that's where I have an issue with leaning too into the hypothesis. Heiser does it. Again, I see why people see value in it. It's nice if they're using their brain, they're thinking about it. It's super cool. Just to kind of pontificate these things and discuss these things. But when they become larger than they really need to be, because clearly from a Bible standpoint, it's a very small portion of the Bible. I mean, I should ask AI to tell me what percentage of the Bible talks about these things. I mean, it would probably be pretty crazy. Um, so anyway, that I could see how that easily could be a problem, right? It's just a stumbling block in faith. Um, and the other thing was he brought up the fact that since there's this altering DNA, he said certainly it could be happening today, and he's like this thing was still ongoing where these fallen angels are still doing things with humans to make these people on Earth still currently running things, and now you can see why Tucker's so interested in this narrative. And that's kind of why I titled this "Breakfast with Fruit Loops." Not so much that it was Stephen DeYoung being a Fruit Loop. Uh, I just think that he really, I don't think he really, maybe he did or maybe he didn't, but Tucker is clearly the Fruit Loop. and he's trying to draw things out for an episode that's going to be pretty exciting that a lot of people are going to be interested in, right? I mean, who doesn't want to talk about Nephilim? So, but then he brought up these altering DNA things. He calls them the anti-saints as I guess, an analogy or a way of explaining them, which I thought fascinating because then it's like, so what? So what do you believe saints to be? Like, I mean, so he tries to unpack it with the fact that when you choose to embody something, right, and you give yourself over to something, you ultimately eventually become that thing, right? And that's kind of where it comes into this idea of becoming fully evil versus becoming fully holy. Um, but I still have a hard time with the fact that these humans are becoming these things to the degree that they actually are these things. And it gets kind of to Olson's question yesterday, like, when is it okay to call someone evil? To say this person's evil? Like, I mean, it's clear that we can use judgment and say what they're doing maybe evil, right? But do we know they're actually evil? I don't know. I feel like that's out of my wheelhouse. That's not in my job title, to determine someone's actual soul. So, and we do it all the time in society. That person is evil. That person's a Nazi. That person's a fascist. Like they just, and they don't even really, most of the time, they're not even paying attention to who the person is or even having a conversation with the person, but they're quick to make that decision on who they are. So that was interesting to me, and I saw a slippery slope with that. Um, so yeah, saints embodied compared to the opposite of these anti-saints. And then he starts he brought up that drinking blood in these cults and stuff, that drinking blood was forbidden, very much so in the Bible, which you can see, right? But then it's like he walks these lines and has this dialogue with all these slippery slopes of having to explain things differently. For instance, the idea that, well, if blood drinking is forbidden, but yet Jesus gave us the Eucharist, and in some traditions, they actually believe it physically, the substance actually changes. It begs a question of accountability, right? I mean, that's a problem. Um, so that was, that's kind of, it's just like you start creating more problems, more questions, and actually delivering answers when you're talking about things with such certainty. Um, so anyway, I brought up already the technology gifts from demons. It's like the idea that the creator of all things, the entire universe that stands from before eternity past, that creates all these things, and the demons are the ones that are gifting anybody anything. It's like, I don't know. I sometimes it's just hard to see that connection. I did think it was interesting. We got to the physics changing part. He brought up, he thought that physics changed after the flood. I believe it. I believe that there was definitely a fundamental spiritual shift, because that's why he sent the flood. But I think that for me, I think the argument can be made that it happened after the fall, that the physics changed for us after the fall. So it's kind of like the world was a certain way. We fell, we got cursed, and that curse changed everything. And it created an entire wave and riff and everything that was going to come down up until the flood, right? And when God made a decision to send the flood, it was a way of purifying the earth, right? It was a way to get rid of whatever we can say happened in this time frame that they speak of the ancient past with the men of renown, whoever they were. Were they tall people? Not tall people? Maybe. Um, Supernatural? I don't know if that's what they were. I don't know if they had different DNA. My thinking is probably not. But again, I don't begrudge people for believing that because it's not really it's not a first order issue for me. So it is, I just don't like going down these rabbit holes and staying down them and dwelling in them and making them the most important thing in our lives. But anyway, um, I also think that there was a fundamental difference with with I guess if you were saying physics changed then, I think that when Christ died, rose, and ascended into heaven, I think that represented another fundamental massive shift in the world and how this spiritual battle was taking place. Um, it was an entirely different thing altogether because I don't think we truly understand how much evil was in the world until that happened. And I think that's why they talk a lot about, he talks a lot about I saw I saw Satan fall like a bolt of lightning. And I mean there's a lot of that stuff talking. Um yeah. I see you, Claire. I'll bring you in a minute. Matt, yeah, Matt's, not for nothing, but yeah, Father DeYoung himself is hybrid DNA. He's half CRC, half, yeah, exactly. Um, and you can kind of hear that because at the end he kind of says some things that were very much more closer to my tradition than I think an Orthodox tradition. But I do think that like when you hear about how Jesus is healing men that have demons and things like that. Again, I'm not saying any of this stuff doesn't happen anymore. I'm not. I've Fortunately for me, I've never had to be in an environment and had to have these moments where I'm literally witnessing somebody what appears to be possessed. Um, I don't know. I believe it's possible. I know people that say it's they've seen it. So I'm not going to besmirch their testimony on the things that they've seen. I just leave it open, and I'm fine with the fact that if that stuff is happening, God's got it under control regardless. Um, so there was that. I just think that when Christ died, resurrected, and ascended, that represented a fundamental shift in from that time till now, that things were going to be different, that the spiritual war was going to be different. Um, so yeah. So anyway, um, let's see. One thing he said is to get out of bondage, you have to submit yourself to something greater than yourself. And he was talking about this idea of being in bondage to a demon, right? And I'm thinking, okay, cool. But then he went right to, for him, it's the church, the institution. And I'm thinking to myself, what are you talking? Like, come on, man. He's like, and then he emphasized the spiritual father in church. And again, like what, like, I don't care. You have to, I mean, even as a Orthodox priest, I would think that the first thing you would say is Christ would be your, who you're submitting yourself to, first and foremost. Now, whether it was an oversight, whether it was just the way that he was speaking about it, but you can see that his first order priority was the institution and a spiritual father. And that's where we differ as far as this process of, uh, again, maybe it takes someone that you can talk to before you get to a place of submitting yourself to Christ. And I get that. But I don't think I don't know. It's just I had a hard time with the way that he framed it and the way he went about it. Um, so yeah, that was something I noticed. I think of and the idea that we can resist these things. I'm thinking again back to him dying and resurrecting and now sitting on the right hand of the Father, and he's interceding for us. Like this is a fundamental difference in where we're at, right? So I think back when he said to Peter that the devil desires to sift him like wheat. Um, and I think that is meant for all of us, is that the idea that we think we can be so strong in our faith or so, we have it all figured out. And if it wasn't for him and what he did, and that whatever that fundamental change took place in um in time, I think that that is how we're protected from this world being overcome the way that it was before. So anyway, that was something I thought about. He does say at the end, which again, this is where it seemed to me this was the much more enjoyable part of the interview. When he finally got down to the last quarter of the interview, um, he said the average Christian person is trying to follow Christ the best way they know how, in their heart, in their soul. And I think that's right. I think that's what makes me feel a sense of love and peace when it comes to other traditions and my brothers and sisters in Christ that are ultimately trying. They may not, I might not have it right. They might not have it right. And the things that we claim that we know when we really believe, and the things that we do know, we blend in with the things that we believe, right? So I kind of, I just like the fact that it made me like him in the interview a lot more because it is a really great way to see the world, right? And to see these Christians trying. No, we definitely are not as good as we think we are. And that's what made me, when I got to the very last part, at the end, he said a very Calvinist thing. We have to know that we are capable of this horrible, like this evil, right? When he's talking about listening to people's confessions. His grandfather told him a story um, about something bad or whatever, and he gave him the story, "There go I, but for the grace of God." Which, yeah, I mean, every time I think that I'm so much better than someone else, it's like I have this reminder that no, you may think you're better than them, but if it wasn't for God pulling you out of that hole, you would be no different. And I think that's a fundamental difference in seeing the world and seeing me as me myself and what I'm capable of. So I thought that that was really really good. That without God's grace, I couldn't do anything. And coming to terms with these prerequisites for your own repentance. Um, so yeah. So anyway, that's my thoughts. Almost took what 25 minutes. Luke could be proud. Maybe not. Maybe only unless I do an hour of monologuing. But anyway, I thought that stuff was interesting. Um, I definitely only want to be talking to people that have seen this interview. I don't want to be talking to people that if you haven't seen it, that's fine. If you didn't have it, you hadn't have time for it, and you want to come on and you want to talk that, at least just come clean with the fact that you didn't get to see it. That would be great. Um, anyway, I have Claire. I'm going to bring her in, and hold on.
Hi.
Hello, Claire. Hold on one sec.
Yeah, I did see the interview. Just to reassure everyone.
Yeah, you watched the whole thing.
right through, and I did try to tell as many people as possible that the really good bit began from 119, because I have no interest at all in, mythical creatures from the Bible anyway. And also, Moses and his people did not encounter any Nephilim. They only heard of them, but what they did was fight with real people, people in Jericho and, other places they conquered. Isn't that
Yeah,
so?
talking about when the spies went and saw where they sent the spies back. And again, I don't know if that's a symbolic story of their faith in God, or you know, what they saw. I mean, that's why when Jacob was talking about the definitions of some of these words and where they came from and all that stuff, I think it was pretty important to understand that some of this stuff we're reading into a lot of it. So, hey, Matt.
Hey, howdy. Good morning.
What'd you think?
Yeah. Well, I think Father Stephen DeYoung is an interesting hybrid creature. And it strikes me that every Eastern Orthodox figure that we know about, who's in our visibility, who makes content, interacts and does dialogues, all of them are hybrid creatures. And as a result, they're all men of renown. Right? So they all know, they're all like formerly CRC or evangelical. They all know the Western, what is interesting to the Western mind. And then they've all hybridized with this Eastern Orthodox perspective. He's my favorite Nephilim because
Right.
he's half.
It's starting to break up a little.
Sorry, Claire?
Yeah. I was going to ask you if you consider
Apologies.
yourself to be hybrid.
I think it's a metaphor.
I think well, walk with me here, because I think the descriptions, the theories that we got from Stephen DeYoung are relatively, they're very academically digestible. It's not something that would be, it's not what Tucker Carlson probably wanted. It wouldn't make for a great Hollywood movie. He's describing something that essentially he's saying that the most titillating stuff in Genesis is just a direct condemnation of, how the current emperor of Japan is conceived. Do you know what I mean? And lest we think that makes the Bible mundane, I think it actually kind of it's interesting, because if that is the case, that if Stephen DeYoung's theory is, if it holds water, if it's the most sensible, and I tend to think that it is, then
What is his theory? Let's be clear about that before we proceed any further.
Sure. Well, just say, two people conceive a child, as you would normally, like if you went back to, Babylon
yes,
in the
God
600s
and Mary.
BC.
Well, I mean, the Greeks believed that if Zeus came down from Mount Olympus and seduced mortal women, semi-divine beings would be produced. Like, but let me think. I think Caesar was supposed to have been the product of a union between Zeus and Venus. I mean, these were all kind of
Heracles.
Yes. And there was somebody else I can't remember. Adonis. So these are
Achilles.
Yeah. So well, we either choose to believe or not believe, and if we want to believe in these stories, what in our minds makes us want to believe in clearly mythological creatures? Why do we want to believe in that when there's so much that needs to be addressed? But it's just another distraction. isn't it?
Well, Claire, would you find it? I mean, those are very good points.
Yes, we asking you a question.
More digestible if yeah. I think in particular I'm curious about your thoughts on if there was an historical Achilles that the mythology is attempting to capture, and if he's semi-divine, but if you could go back in time and record, I mean, I'm not trying to be too crazy about this, but if you could historically capture what actually happened, and you saw what Stephen DeYoung's describing, you would just see two human beings, and one of them believes that they are possessed. Maybe they're intoxicated, maybe they're under some sort of hallucinogenic, maybe they are demon possessed. But at least one of those partners in that union, they're both humans, but one of them, there's a third figure there. It
What the
spiritually
product of that
speaking.
union, meaning Jesus. Well, we know what Jews really think of Jesus, don't we? They hate him.
Yeah, well, and Stephen DeYoung, I think, carefully described a distinctly different situation where you just have you've got to have a new Adam. You have to have a second Adam, a new creation, but he also has to be a son of David at the same time. How do you do that unless he's born of a woman, but he doesn't have a father? His father is God, like the first Adam's father was.
Right. Well, Muslims think Adam is a prophet, and when I ask them why, they say it's because he acknowledged God by walking and talking with him. Right. That's their story, not because Adam did some wonderful thing. You just have to.
Mhm.
He was the first man who acknowledged God, but you could say it's this colonizing idea of Islam that says Jesus was Muslim, right? You've heard them say that, haven't you?
Absolutely.
So I mean, as far as Muslims are concerned, that they're just saying, well, believing in God is just logical, because if there was a creation, there must have been a creator, and that creator was Allah, who is also the God of Israel. I mean, that's their shtick anyway. And their idea was, yes, the Torah exists. We acknowledge the existence of the Torah, and of course the Jews and the story of Moses. But obviously that revelation wasn't enough, and so here's the Quran. Yay, that's their shtick too. And then they will say that Muhammad is a final prophet and the Quran is a final revelation. And don't be anyone, don't there be anyone saying, here's a new revelation. No, you can't do that. That's it. That's it for humanity, kind of thing. So it's
I think Paul said that too, before the Quran, but they didn't listen to that.
Well, I mean, the thing about Paul is that he's human, right? And not even Christians, claim he has, divine antecedents. And I think that this is fundamentally the problem with the New Testament, because not even Christians claim the New Testament to be divinely authored. Well, Jews say, well, the Torah was handed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and the Muslims say, well, the Quran was revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel.
You want to take that,
Therefore,
Matt?
hmm?
I think we see it differently.
I know, but I'm just explaining the different narratives.
Yeah, but you say Christians don't see the New Testament as being authored by the divine, when we don't see it that way.
Well, you say things like inspired, divinely inspired, right? Because you can't suddenly just turn back and say Matthew was divine, Mark was divine, and the rest of it, and also with regard to the Jefferson Bible, which is, I think, basically the Red Letter Bible. He left out the Pauline epistles.
He left out the miracles, any miracle.
Yeah, because he was saying, look, don't be, fooled by stories of miracles and monsters and stuff. Just concentrate on the word of Jesus, because that's what Christianity was supposed to be about, the teachings of Jesus, not his magic tricks. Well, I'm sure that was what Jefferson meant, and then of course there's a narrative that Paul never met Jesus, so the story of Paul and his Damascene conversion is maybe not to completely not to be completely relied on, and who helped Paul when he collapsed in a heap when he saw that vision, and then all kinds of stories, and of course who wrote the book of Hebrews, who wrote Acts and Revelation. These questions naturally arise in the mind of a lawyer, you see, and Jefferson was a lawyer, and that there are rules of evidence. So if you're trying to prove the existence of God to an atheist, you might say, well, the Torah is from God, and that is direct evidence of God, or the Quran is from God. That would be direct evidence. And then the other category of evidence is hearsay, you see. And hearsay is so and so said he heard so and so said that
Hey, Claire,
the victim was murdered.
we got 22 minutes. Let's have a little back and forth. Matt, what's your sense on this?
Yeah, well, I'd be curious what Claire thinks about my response here, but I'm thinking about how the Christian understanding, and this, my understanding is this would be the Jewish too today, is that the Bible is kind of incarnate in itself, in the sense of it being it's another hybrid being in a way. It's 100% human, it's 100% divine. If you'll let me play fast and loose with some metaphors. Unlike the Islamic, that's correct. Unlike in a way the Mormon Bible, which is American Islam. The Christian understanding is that it's both and you would expect that from us because the word incarnate in the ultimate sense is 100% human and divine, and that's Jesus. You'd expect us to take that position, and I think that's very consistent.
Do I have to assume that all Americans are idolaters and worship their presidents who are carved on the mountains of North Dakota on Mount Rushmore? I don't see why being any race or nation condemns you to idolatry, particularly if you claim to worship the Abrahamic God who, made such a point of forbidding it.
Of making images, or of making images of the divine?
Well, yeah, I mean, it does say in the 10 Commandments, it's the first commandment. It's not, the 9th or the 10th, thou shalt not worship other gods.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are on a show with a CRC host, and you are, we are both guests. I myself have been a Reformed Christian as well, so we might agree with you on having reservations about carved images, and our hybrid DNA Eastern Orthodox priest on Tucker Carlson agrees with you that we deified George Washington, and then we made a carved image out of him in DC, which I think is interesting. So,
well, I mean, Lincoln sits like Zeus, at the Lincoln Memorial, but be that
exactly
as it
that.
may, I mean, not everybody worships statues, but I guess as Americans you should pay some heed to what your founding father said, because to ignore what they said would be, I suppose, un-American, and you used to talk about things like that. But I do think America is obviously a quantum leap for Western civilization, because prior to that, no one in Europe had any rights. They didn't even have the right to have their own opinion or their own religion, because all subjects of Christian monarchs had to, follow the religion of their monarch, and woe betide you if you were a different kind of Christian to your monarch, until the system broke down, and it began to break down, in the time of the English Civil War. Even though it wasn't really a religious war, that I guess once you're unpopular, people throw all kinds of things at you, and I guess the Anglicans at the time didn't like Charles I having a Catholic wife, and French to boot. But fundamentally, it's about taxes, right? Charles went too far in the imposition of ship money, and then people found all sorts of reasons not to have to pay it, because he was basically saying, I have the right to do it. I don't have to call Parliament, and you have to pay because I'm your monarch. So shut up and pay up. And I guess the barons wouldn't have it. And the American Revolution was also about taxes, and so was the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution was about the First World War going very wrong for the Russians.
So the crazy part about it is like, from a perspective standpoint, I truly do believe there are people in America that definitely idolize America, right? No question. However, when I stand before the Lincoln Monument and look up at the statue that was created to memorialize him, I am seeing something much larger behind him that guided him, whether he knew it or not, but I believe he did, and did these wonderful things for this country. I don't see this guy as being some pillar of my country that I need to hold up and prop up in a godlike sense, just like George Washington. Because what happens when we idolize these men, the actual men? We look at all the sins that they create. Something comes out, this, that, and the other thing. And so it totally devalues what God is and what he's capable of, and what his role is in the whole thing,
Well, I don't think Washington was deified. I mean, I guess without him, you wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War. And Lincoln is kind of deified because the American Civil War was in fact a war of American unification, that made you, stronger, and and you acquired some Mexican and Spanish territories, and eventually kicked all the Europeans out with your Monroe Doctrine. But that the American Civil War was only part of the process. But I don't see why people can't read what George Washington said in his farewell speech. I mean, I think it's a perfectly good speech. He predicted all kinds of things that did eventually happen, the bad stuff that he warned against. And now I find no American will even read the speech. Or they'll give reasons like, oh, it's too long, it's too archaic, the language, and oh, who cares? He's just another dead white man. I mean, wow. I mean,
well, Claire, like, that's one of the interesting things about a republic like ours, where if we have a king, it's our constitution in a way. We have a formal document that's our governor, rather than a throne and a man on that throne. And that means that the men and the women in this country are always in flux, circumambulating this particular document and trying to figure out their relationship to it, including George Washington. We always have to, it's a challenge. We're continually reevaluating every person's distance or proximity to that document. And if they're holding up, Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, if they're living up to those particular ideals. And that's yeah, it's a revolutionary approach to governance.
Yeah, where did we get that from? The idea.
Sparta, for one, maybe.
I mean, like we use the
Rome.
Bible to
Yeah.
hold
Republican
our
Rome.
religious leaders accountable, right? I mean, and that's that's the premise behind the Constitution, is to hold these leaders accountable to something greater than themselves.
Yeah, Mount Sinai. Even Moses fell short of Torah by the end, and that had to be renegotiated. So yeah, very well said. It's a fair point.
Well, I mean, obviously, the Constitution is it's meant to be the supreme authority because the founding fathers knew that in time they would, grow old and die and not be there to supervise events. So, here's a document that we so carefully drafted. Refer to it when in doubt. But even then, the document allows itself to be changed under certain conditions. But I mean, I think the most important thing about being a republic is that, you can get rid of the president if he is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. But you can't get rid of a king because, he is a law. In fact, he is above the law. And logically and necessarily, he has to be above the law to impose a law. We go back to the times when the king actually made the laws without any consultation at all, apparently, because he had absolute power, being an absolute monarch, which was defended by Christianity, because that was the whole purpose of Christianity. Why did Constantine even bother changing the Roman religion? And we just have to look back at, how things were before Constantine became, the emperor of Rome, and then we
Can I ask something, Claire?
why.
Claire, how do you take a podcast about an interview with Stephen DeYoung and Tucker Carlson, and we end up here?
Okay, let's go back to what the most important part of the interview was not about the Nephilim, but 1 hour, 19 minutes. That is where the interview came to life for me. So we could talk about that if we remember, if we got that far. I don't know if people got that far.
Yeah, we were talking about how the world has gotten evil. What does this mean?
Because we
That part of the interview, huh?
Yeah, we ignore the rules. We ignore the first one. And what I'm trying to say is idolatry is something that we all fall into, even if we have a religion that says no, we shouldn't. The Jews keep, they're just known for their recidivism, right? And the book of Jeremiah even says, you Jews, you're the bride of God, but you behave like prostitutes. But I'll still take you back. That's what it says in the book of Jeremiah. And which also mentions, the new covenant. But obviously the covenant cannot be a person. It has to be a document with the parties agreeing to it, having written down or agreed in writing, what it is that they're supposed to have agreed to. So I would say the new covenant is obviously the Quran, but of course, Christians will say it's Jesus, but, what do Jews think it might mean? Because I think they've just ignored it, right? So when I say to Jews, do you think the new covenant might be the Quran, that they all kind of, they ignore me, presumably because they haven't thought about it and therefore they don't have an answer.
I think the Quran was probably originally a document it was the new covenant, so to speak, for Noahides. I think that was its original intention, which you may agree with.
Well, yes, because I've been trying to say to them, okay, a lot of these Gentiles they do worship idols. I mean, to be fair, yes, they do, and and I had to think as an agnostic, what harm would you suffer even if God doesn't exist, to punish you for your idolatry. And of course, it would be the opportunity cost. Like, well, you could have been rightly guided if you followed this book of rules, but since you prefer to make up the rules as you went along, you fell into all kinds of ditches again and again. And you know, but I mean, the thing about the Declaration of Independence is that Jefferson referred to certain unalienable rights. I mean, what do you think he meant? Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what what's a full list? And where are they contained? We know.
You don't think they're self-evident, as the document says?
Well, about men being created equal, yes, but if we only said that to say, we all have the equal right, provided we satisfy certain conditions of being the national leader of America, and not just because our papa was king. That's what he meant about, being created equal.
Morning, Claire.
Morning.
Hey, so
Morning, Olson.
I hear you've been just having a lot of fun little chit chat and beating around the bush. So clearly you're not wanting to address the elephant in the room, which was where he said churches and religions should be hospitals, not courtrooms. Can we have a talk about that? Because that's really
well, yes, I thank you
the
for
main
reminding
thing.
me.
Yeah.
So what's the disease? The disease is idolatry.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
yeah.
part of
Well, walk that out a little bit.
Yeah.
I might be willing to follow you on that. But walk it out, Claire.
Well, Olson reminded us about what Father DeYoung said about churches being hospitals. So if you were in hospital, were diseased, were ill. So what is the illness? And I'm saying it must be the the moral disease of idolatry that has been coursing through our veins for centuries.
So what's the cure?
Yeah.
The cure is to confess our sins and say, yes, we have been wrong. We shouldn't worship a man, and we should pay more attention to God's word if we do believe in God and take it more seriously.
Wouldn't that be
all the things he forbade.
Yeah, wouldn't that be more courtroomish, right? You're coming before the judge and casting yourself down on the judge's knees and saying, "I have done wrong. Please don't throw me into the bad place."
Well, yeah, because if you're going to accept that, if suffering is punishment for sin, then when we suffer, we have to ask ourselves, what is God punishing us for? And then we go through the laws that he made for us, and then we go, oh yeah, we broke that rule and the others. So no wonder we're suffering now.
Right. So that goes back more to more of a courtroom, though, right? And that's what we were saying. It's more of a hospital than a courtroom.
Well, I don't think we even need a hospital. We wouldn't, because the priesthood is, if you think about it, the priesthood is the showmanship that is necessary to defend the king. Obviously the king saying, well, I've got divine right. It's like, well, yeah, so what? You have to show us. And then, then it has to be all the cathedrals and the music and, the showtime folks and rituals and festivals and that kind of thing. And it is the priesthood to put on the show.
So do you think, so I disagree. I think it should be, or I understand it should be more of a hospital than a courtroom. And I get there by looking at human nature just in general, right? Recidivism is usually not curtailed by more jailing and more rules and more courtrooms, right? Recidivism is easy for you to say, is usually done by a change of the heart. This is not change of the heart is something that comes about through a cure, right? A cure, a healing, if it will, right? We all have
change of mind.
I would say the heart changes before the mind. Um, you can't have the mind help lead the heart to there. There are some situations where that happens, but I'd say that's more rare than it is than the rule. Um,
It's only a metaphor because the heart doesn't do our thinking. It's the mind, right?
right. So then you're getting into what is consciousness and where do thoughts come from and things like that. And so I would say it would there'd be a healing of the mind, a healing of the conscious, and um, reformed people would say it's God's grace that's coming in and healing that. More Arminians would say um, that it's an acceptance of God's grace and healing on those things. Um, the Catholics would say it's the partaking of the Eucharist and the sacraments that are imparting God's grace on us, but in all aspects, right? It's God's grace that's coming and healing. And I think that's the thing that you've wrestled with in this community for so long is just trying to understand that idea of grace.
It's a name. The name of a woman. I mean, what does it mean? You're saying, well, actually, Chris Howard talks about cheap grace, right? And it's, Christians sometimes saying, "Oh, the Holy Spirit entered into me, and I was born again." And do they really mean it? I mean, you Olsen told me that there were people in your summer camp who didn't feel anything, but they just pretended that the Holy Spirit entered into them.
Well, I
To,
didn't say that. I don't know if I'd say they pretended, but they had real emotional things, emotional highs. Um, but did those emotional highs bear fruit in the end, right? That was what I was trying to say. So if
yes,
I
and I'm saying, if you want to choose a religion, use your intellect, because you can say you met God and spoke to him and whatever, and the people around you will say, yeah, but you were drunk, weren't you? You were hallucinating, and therefore you need to use arguments that you can use every time people ask you.
Sure. And so coming back to the ideas, right? How many arguments have changed hearts and minds in that way, right? Like usually there's some sort of relational context, whether it's a divine relational or horizontal, right? PBK says I'm a Christian because my parents raised me that way, right? That's the horizontal. Um, and so usually there's some sort of
Okay, I mean, he could have said, "Well, I'm an Aztec because my
because
ancestors were Aztecs." I
hmm
mean, there's actually a verse in the Quran that says God does not change the lot of people who will not change what is in their
hmm
hearts, and that there's another verse that says, if you're just following the religion of your ancestors because it's a religion of your ancestors, even though they had no guidance, what are you doing? Um, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is that if you believe in the whole story of the Abrahamic God, then you must believe that he is logical. He,
so so I don't see them as intention, right? I see the logical is bringing us to a point, like you were saying, right? We need to confess. We represent ourselves, and in that case, there is a courtroom, but that's not where the change happens, right? The change doesn't happen in the courtroom.
it
Um,
happens in
if you
jail,
go
does it?
right, no, so if you right, this is an illegal. This is a legal thing even today, right? If you go before court and you're mentally unwell, right, you don't go to jail. They send you to a place to become mentally well. And
Or
I'd
they
say that.
execute you because they decided that you did it on purpose, right?
I mean, in America, you can't be executed if you're not mentally well.
Okay. But I mean, the defense of insanity often arises when somebody has committed murder. And then they would say that the balance of their mind were upset. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were doing was wrong. But um, can you say that of Christians? I mean,
I
it's
could
been going
say,
on for a long time.
I would say that for most of us, we are enthralled under things and compulsions, spirits and compulsions we do not fully control. most of the time. And it again, it's through the power of healing, through the power that God's grace that allows us to overcome those spirits and compulsions, right? That's what basically Jesus says, and then says it in the epistles in the New Testament. That's the thing, right? It says we were enthralled under the spirits, and it is but by the grace of God that he has defeated them and called us to be heirs, not of things that we've done, but of things that he's done.
And on that note, that was nice to end that way. I appreciate you guys coming on this morning. Sorry I had to mute you, Claire, just so that we could end this. Y'all can take it over to the Chris Howard show, though, for sure, because he's kicking it right now. So anyway, thanks again, everybody. I appreciate it. And thanks for indulging me in this topic. So with that, I'll end the stream.